The morning mist clung to the towering ponderosa pines like ghostly fingers as Thomas Mackenzie raised his double-bit axe above his head. The sharp crack of steel biting into wood echoed across the remote canyon, followed by the satisfying thud of another chunk of bark falling to the forest floor. Tom paused to wipe the sweat from his weathered brow, his calloused hands gripping the worn hickory handle with practiced ease. The Arizona Territory in December of 1887 was an unforgiving place, especially this high up in the Mogollon Rim country. At nearly 6,000 feet elevation, the air was thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine sap and the distant promise of snow. Tom had chosen this isolation deliberately, 3 years now since he'd fled the memories that haunted every street corner back in Philadelphia. "Steady now, old girl," he murmured to the massive pine before him, his Irish accent still thick despite years in the American West. The tree groaned ominously as his axe bit deeper into its trunk. Tom had learned to read the language of falling timber, the subtle shifts in weight, the warning creaks that told him when to step clear. His small log cabin sat in a clearing about a quarter-mile down the slope, smoke rising lazily from its stone chimney. It wasn't much. One room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow bed covered with wool blankets and a bearskin. But it was his, and more importantly, it was far from the prying eyes and well-meaning sympathy of civilization. The work was hard, but Tom preferred it that way. Each swing of the axe helped quiet the voices in his head. Margaret's laugh, little Patrick's excited chatter, baby Sarah's soft breathing in her crib, all silenced in one terrible night when the tenement fire had swept through their building like the wrath of God himself. Tom had been working late at the docks, coming home to find nothing but charred timbers and the unbearable weight of survivor's guilt. A distant rumble of thunder made him glance up at the pewter-grey sky. Storm coming in from the west by the look of it. Tom quickened his pace, wanting to finish sectioning this trunk before the weather turned. The nearest settlement, a rough mining town called Copper Creek, was 2 days' ride south, and he had no intention of making that journey until spring. As he worked, Tom remained alert to the sounds of the forest around him. This was Apache country, and though the worst of the fighting had ended with Geronimo's surrender last year, tensions still ran high. Rogue bands of warriors occasionally passed through these mountains, and a lone white man was vulnerable prey. Tom kept his Winchester rifle propped against a nearby tree within easy reach, but today the forest seemed unusually quiet. Even the jays and squirrels had fallen silent, creating an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of Tom's neck stand up. He'd learned to trust his instincts out here. They'd kept him alive when book learning would have gotten him killed. The big pine finally surrendered to his assault, crashing to the forest floor with a thunderous roar that sent a cloud of ravens into the grey sky. Tom stepped back, breathing hard, and surveyed his work. 3 days of cutting and trimming, and he'd have enough lumber to repair his cabin's roof before the heavy snows came. As he bent to begin limbing the fallen giant, a sound made him freeze, the soft whimper of something in pain carried on the cold wind. Tom straightened slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. The sound came again, weaker this time, from somewhere downslope toward the creek. It could be a wounded animal, he told himself, a deer caught in a deadfall, or maybe a bear cub separated from its mother. But something in the quality of that sound, something almost human, made his chest tighten with an emotion he'd tried to bury 3 years ago. Against his better judgment, Tom found himself walking toward the sound, his rifle cradled in his arms. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he picked his way carefully through the undergrowth, following a game trail that wound between massive boulders and fallen logs. Tom found her huddled against the base of an ancient oak tree, so still he almost missed her entirely. At first glance, she looked like a small bundle of rags left by some passing traveler. But as he drew closer, Tom's breath caught in his throat. It was a child, a girl, no more than 12 years old, with long black hair matted with pine needles and dirt. She was Apache, that much was clear from her traditional dress, a buckskin tunic decorated with intricate beadwork, now torn and stained. Her moccasins were worn through at the soles, and her thin legs were scratched and bleeding from brambles. But it was her face that struck Tom like a physical blow. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, the unmistakable signs of prolonged hunger and exhaustion. The child's breathing was shallow and rapid, her lips cracked and pale. She clutched something to her chest, a small leather pouch, probably containing whatever meager possessions she had left. Tom knelt slowly, setting his rifle aside, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Easy there, little one," he said softly, though he doubted she understood English. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, dark, intelligent eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. When she saw Tom's bearded face above her, she tried to shrink back against the tree trunk, but she was too weak to move far. Tom felt his heart clench with a familiar pain. She was about the same age Sarah would have been now if she'd lived. The thought threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed it aside. This child needed help, and he was the only one here to give it. "You're safe," he continued, his voice gentle. "Safe, understand? I won't hurt you." He held up his empty hands to show he meant no harm. The girl watched him warily as he slowly removed his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her thin shoulders. She was lighter than he'd expected when he lifted her, nothing but skin and bones beneath the buckskin dress. She didn't resist, which worried Tom more than if she'd fought him. It meant she was too weak to care what happened to her. The walk back to his cabin felt endless, with the child a barely breathing weight in his arms. Tom found himself talking to her, partly to keep her conscious and partly to calm his own nerves. "My name's Tom," he said. "Thomas Mackenzie. I live just up the hill here. Got a warm fire and some food. You'll be all right." Storm clouds were gathering overhead as Tom kicked open his cabin door. The interior was sparse but clean, a single room dominated by the stone fireplace, with his few possessions arranged with military precision. He laid the girl gently on his narrow bed and covered her with every blanket he owned. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and Tom quickly built it back up, adding split pine until flames danced high in the hearth. The girl watched his every movement with those dark, unblinking eyes. She hadn't spoken a word, but he could see the intelligence there, the careful assessment of this strange white man who'd brought her to his home. "You must be hungry," Tom said, moving to his small store of provisions. He had salt pork, some dried beans, and a bit of cornmeal. Rough fare, but nourishing. He put water on to boil and began preparing a simple broth, adding small pieces of meat and letting it simmer slowly. As he worked, Tom found himself stealing glances at the child. Her breathing had steadied somewhat in the warmth of the cabin, but she was still far too thin. How long had she been wandering alone in the wilderness? Where was her family? The questions tumbled through his mind, but he knew better than to expect answers she couldn't give. When the broth was ready, Tom ladled it into his only bowl and brought it to the bedside. The girl watched him approach with a mixture of wariness and desperate hunger. He held the spoon to her lips, and after a moment's hesitation, she allowed him to feed her small sips of the warm liquid. "That's it," Tom encouraged, as she managed to swallow. "Just a little at a time. Don't want to make yourself sick." Outside, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, pattering against the single window like tiny fingers. The storm Tom had sensed was moving in fast, and he silently thanked whatever providence had led him to find the child when he did. Another hour in the cold, and she might not have survived. As the girl's eyes grew heavy with exhaustion and the warmth of food in her belly, Tom settled into his wooden chair by the fire. He had no idea what he'd gotten himself into. Harboring an Apache child was dangerous enough, but keeping her here raised questions he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. What if her people came looking for her? What if the authorities in Copper Creek found out? But as he watched her small form beneath the blankets, finally sleeping peacefully for what might be the first time in days, Tom knew he couldn't have done anything else. Some lines couldn't be crossed, some responsibilities couldn't be ignored. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles, but tonight a child was safe and warm, and that would have to be enough. Tom woke before dawn to the sound of muffled sobbing. The fire had burned low during the night, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. He sat up quietly in his makeshift bed on the floor. He'd given up his proper bed to the child, and saw her small form shaking beneath the blankets. She was awake, staring at the dying embers, with tears streaming silently down her face. In the dim light, she looked even more fragile than before, like a wounded bird that might take flight at the slightest movement. "Hey there," Tom said softly, rising slowly so as not to startle her. "You're all right. You're safe." The girl turned toward him, and Tom saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten, a profound sadness that no child should carry. She spoke then, for the first time since he'd found her, her voice barely above a whisper. The words were in Apache, flowing like water over stones, But Tom didn't need to understand the language to hear the pain in them. "I know," he said gently, moving to rebuild the fire. "I know you're scared, but you're not alone now." As flames began to lick at the fresh kindling, Tom noticed the girl had sat up, clutching that small leather pouch to her chest. In the growing light, he could see it was intricately beaded with symbols he didn't recognize. Probably something precious, maybe the only thing she had left of her family. Tom prepared another bowl of broth, this one thicker than the night before, with small pieces of meat and some wild onions he'd gathered in the fall. The girl accepted it gratefully, her small hands wrapping around the warm ceramic, as if it were a lifeline. "My name is Tom," he said, pointing to himself. "Tom." He repeated it slowly, then pointed to her with raised eyebrows. The girl studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust him with something so personal as her name. Finally, she touched her chest with one thin finger and said, "Ayana, Ayana," Tom repeated, trying to get the pronunciation right. The girl almost smiled at his clumsy attempt, and Tom felt a small victory. "That's a beautiful name." Over the next hour, as the storm continued to rage outside, Tom and Ayana began to build a bridge of understanding. Tom would point to objects around the cabin, the fire, his axe, the window, and say the English word, while Ayana would respond with the Apache equivalent. Neither understood much of what the other said, but somehow they communicated. Tom learned that Ayana was indeed 12 years old, holding up fingers to show him when he asked. She had been walking for many days. She showed him on his fingers again, 8 or 9 by his count. When he asked about her family, her face crumpled, and she spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice breaking with emotion. "Gone," she said in English, the word obviously recently learned from contact with settlers. "All gone." Tom felt his throat constrict. He knew that look, that tone. He'd worn them himself for 3 years now. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it more than she could possibly know. "I'm so sorry, Ayana." As the day wore on, the child grew stronger. She was able to eat more solid food, some cornbread Tom baked in his small Dutch oven, and strips of jerky from his winter stores. Color began to return to her pale cheeks, and she started showing interest in her surroundings. Tom found himself talking to her as he went about his daily chores, maintaining the fire, checking his traps, preparing meals. Even though she couldn't understand most of what he said, she seemed to find comfort in the sound of his voice. And strangely, Tom found that talking to another human being, even one who couldn't answer back, eased something inside him that had been wound tight for years. "My family's gone too," he found himself saying as he whittled shavings for kindling. Ayana watched him work, sitting cross-legged on the bed, with his coat still wrapped around her shoulders. "My wife Margaret, and my children." There was a fire. He paused, surprised at how easily the words came. "I couldn't save them." Ayana tilted her head, clearly not understanding the words but recognizing the pain in his voice. She said something in Apache, soft, musical words that sounded like a prayer or a blessing. By evening, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Everything outside the cabin was pristine white, from the drooping pine boughs to the split-rail fence around Tom's small garden plot. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crack of a tree branch heavy with snow. Tom was banking the fire for the night when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was distant, but unmistakable. The rhythmic beating of drums, carried on the still night air. Apache drums. Ayana heard it too. She sat bolt upright on the bed, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. She spoke rapidly in her native tongue, then looked at Tom with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Your people?" Tom asked, though he already knew the answer. Ayana nodded, then said something else in Apache. She pointed to herself, then to the door, then back to herself. The meaning was clear enough. They were looking for her. Tom felt his pulse quicken. He'd known this moment would come, but he'd hoped for more time. Time to think, to plan, to figure out how to handle a situation that could go very wrong very quickly. Apache warriors didn't negotiate with white men who took their children, even with the best of intentions. The drumming grew closer, more distinct. Tom could make out at least 3 different drums now, maybe more. That meant a substantial party of warriors, not just a few concerned relatives. They would be armed and ready for trouble. "What do I do?" Tom asked aloud, though he was really asking himself. He looked at Ayana, who was watching him with those intelligent dark eyes. She seemed to be waiting for something, a decision maybe, or a sign of his intentions. Tom walked to his gun rack and lifted down his Winchester rifle. Ayana's eyes followed the movement, but she didn't seem afraid. If anything, she looked expectant. "I won't let them hurt you," Tom said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking about her people hurting her for being with a white man, or about white authorities who might try to take her away. "Whatever happens, I won't let anyone hurt you." The drums were very close now, just beyond the tree line by Tom's estimation. Soon they would see the smoke from his chimney, the warm glow of lamplight in his window. Soon everything would change. Dawn broke clear and cold over the snow-covered clearing, painting the white landscape in shades of rose and gold. Tom had barely slept, sitting in his chair by the window with his rifle across his knees, listening to the drums that had continued intermittently through the night. Now in the growing light he could see them. They emerged from the tree line like ghosts materializing from the morning mist, Apache warriors on horseback, moving with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle. Tom counted them quickly. 50 riders, maybe more, strung out in a loose line that curved around his cabin like a crescent moon. They were armed with rifles, bows, and lances, but they held their weapons casually, not in immediate threat. At the center of the line rode a man who was clearly their leader, tall and lean, with graying hair braided with feathers and silver ornaments. His face was weathered by years of desert sun and mountain wind, marked with the kind of dignity that came from leading men through impossible odds. Even at this distance, Tom could see the resemblance to Ayana in his strong features. "Your father?" Tom asked softly. Ayana had been awake since the first light, pressed against the window beside him. She nodded, her small face a mixture of joy and apprehension. She spoke rapidly in Apache, then looked at Tom with an expression that seemed to be asking for permission. Tom set his rifle aside and opened the cabin door. The cold morning air hit him like a slap, but he stepped out onto his small porch anyway, his hands visible and empty. The Apache warriors watched him with the kind of stillness that predators have just before they strike. The leader urged his horse forward, stopping about 20 yards from the cabin. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the clearing, the Apache words flowing like music. Tom didn't understand them, but he heard the question in the tone. "He wants to know if you have his daughter," Ayana said from behind him. Tom turned, surprised to find her standing in the doorway. Her English was better than he'd realized. "Tell him yes," Tom said. "Tell him she's safe." Ayana spoke in rapid Apache, her young voice clear in the cold air. The leader's expression didn't change, but Tom saw some of the tension go out of the warriors' postures. A few of them lowered their weapons slightly. The leader asked another question, longer this time. Tom caught what might have been his own name in the flow of Apache words. "He asks why the white man called Tom Mackenzie helped an Apache child," Ayana translated. "He says his scouts have been watching you. They know you had no reason to be kind to one of the people you call enemy." Tom felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes on him. These men had probably lost friends and family to white soldiers and settlers. They had every reason to distrust his motivations, to assume the worst about his character. How could he explain that he'd simply done what any decent person would do? "Tell him," Tom said slowly, "that I saw a child who needed help. Tell him that where I come from, we don't let children suffer, no matter who they are or what they look like." Ayana translated, and Tom heard murmurs ripple through the line of warriors. The leader studied Tom's face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth there. Then the Apache chief dismounted and walked forward, stopping just at the edge of the porch. Up close, Tom could see the man was probably in his 50s, with scars on his hands and arms that spoke of a lifetime of battles. But his eyes held intelligence and something that might have been respect. He spoke again, and Ayana translated. "He says his name is Nalnish. He is war leader of the Chiricahua band. Ayana is his daughter, the child of his heart." Nalnish reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that made Tom's breath catch. A scalp of reddish-brown hair, clearly taken from a white man. The message was unmistakable. This man had killed before, and he could kill again. But then Nalnish did something unexpected. He set the scalp carefully on the porch railing and stepped back, his hands empty. When he spoke this time, his voice was formal, ceremonial. "He says," Ayana translated, her own voice filled with wonder, "that he came here to take vengeance on the white man who stole his daughter. But he sees now that you did not steal, you saved. He says the tracks around your cabin tell a story of kindness, not cruelty. Nalnish spoke again, gesturing to his warriors. He says his men tracked you yesterday. They saw you gather firewood in the storm to keep me warm. They saw you give me your own blankets, your own food. They saw you sleep on the floor so I could have your bed. Ayana's voice grew thick with emotion. He says they have never seen a white man treat an Apache child as if she were his own. The war leader reached into another pouch and withdrew something that gleamed in the morning sun, a beautifully crafted silver medallion on a leather cord, inscribed with symbols Tom didn't recognize, but which clearly held great meaning. Nalnish stepped forward again and placed the medallion around Tom's neck, speaking in Apache as he did so. The words had the weight of ritual, of ceremony. He says, Ayana whispered, tears streaming down her face, that you are now under the protection of the Chiricahua Apache. Any who harm you will answer to 50 warriors. He says you have shown honor to his people, and honor will be shown to you. Tom felt the weight of the medallion against his chest, and something else, a weight he'd been carrying for 3 years, the burden of guilt and isolation beginning to lift. Tell him I'm honored, he said. Tell him I would be proud to call him friend. As Ayana translated, Tom saw something remarkable happen. The line of warriors began to dismount, and one by one they approached the cabin. Each man placed some small token on the porch, an arrowhead, a piece of turquoise, a perfectly shaped stone, and spoke a few words in Apache before stepping back. They are giving you gifts, Ayana explained. Each man is pledging his personal protection. This has never been done for a white man before. When the ceremony was complete, Nalnish spoke one final time, his words directed not to Tom but to his daughter. Ayana listened, then turned to Tom with eyes bright with tears. He says, I may choose. I can return with my people to the reservation, or, she hesitated, or I can stay with the white man who showed me kindness when my own people could not find me. Tom knelt down so he was at eye level with the girl. Ayana, he said gently, you belong with your family. Your father loves you. Your people love you. She nodded, understanding, but her next words surprised him. He says I may visit you, when the snows melt, when the hunting is good. He says you are family now, too. As the Apache warriors prepared to leave, taking Ayana with them back to her people, Tom felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, a sense of belonging, of purpose. He'd saved one child's life, and in doing so, had somehow saved his own. The medallion around his neck caught the morning sun as he waved goodbye, a silver promise that he was no longer alone in the wilderness. 3 months had passed since that snowy morning, when 50 Apache warriors had ridden away from Tom's cabin, taking Ayana with them but leaving behind something precious, hope. Winter had been long and harsh in the mountains, with storms that buried the cabin to its windows and temperatures that turned breath to ice crystals in the air. But Tom had endured it with a lightness in his heart he hadn't felt since Philadelphia. The silver medallion never left his neck, warming against his chest as he worked. True to their word, the Apache had kept watch over him. Twice during the worst blizzards, Tom had found fresh game hanging from his porch, a deer haunch, rabbit meat, once even part of an elk, left by invisible guardians who moved through the forest like spirits. He was never alone, even when he couldn't see another human soul for weeks at a time. Now in early March, the snow was finally beginning to retreat. Patches of brown earth showed through the white blanket, and the creek behind his cabin ran with the musical sound of snowmelt. Tom was splitting wood behind his cabin when he heard the horses approaching, not the ghostly appearance of Apache warriors this time, but the heavy clopping of shod hooves and the jingle of harness that meant white men. He straightened, his hand moving instinctively to the medallion at his throat. Around the bend in the trail came 5 riders, 3 soldiers in blue uniforms and 2 civilians, one of whom Tom recognized as Sheriff Morrison from Copper Creek. The sheriff was a hard man with pale eyes and a reputation for dealing harshly with Indian troubles. "Mackenzie," Morrison called out as they approached the cabin, "need to have a word with you." Tom leaned his axe against the woodpile and walked around to meet them, keeping his movements casual, despite the tension coiling in his stomach. The soldiers looked young and nervous, their hands resting too obviously on their weapons. "Sheriff," Tom nodded. "What brings you up the mountain?" Morrison dismounted, his boots crunching in the remaining snow. "Got reports you've been consorting with Apache, harboring fugitives maybe. That's a serious charge in this territory. Is it now? Tom's Irish accent grew thicker, as it always did when he was angry. And who might be making such reports? That doesn't matter, said the civilian. Tom didn't recognize a thin man in an expensive coat who looked entirely out of place in the wilderness. I'm Agent Fitzgerald from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We've had word that Apache raiders have been active in this area and that you may have information about their movements. Tom almost smiled. If they only knew how much information he had about Apache movements and how little he intended to share with men like these. I work alone, Tom said carefully. Haven't seen hide nor hair of any Apache in months. It wasn't technically a lie. He hadn't seen them, but he'd certainly felt their presence, their protection, and he knew with the certainty that came from having lived in these mountains for 3 years that they were watching this conversation unfold. That's not what we heard, Morrison pressed. Got word there was a whole war party up here not 3 months back, 50 warriors or more. 50 warriors? Tom raised an eyebrow. Sheriff, if 50 Apache warriors had come calling on me, do you think I'd be standing here talking to you now? The sheriff's pale eyes narrowed. Maybe not if you were helping them. Maybe they'd have reason to keep you alive. The accusation hung in the cold air like a challenge. Tom felt his temper beginning to rise, but before he could respond, Agent Fitzgerald stepped forward. Mackenzie, let me be direct. The Apache on the reservation have been talking. They mention a white man in the mountains, a man they call friend to the people. They say this man wears the mark of their protection. Fitzgerald's eyes fixed on the silver medallion visible at Tom's throat. That's a very distinctive piece of jewelry you're wearing. Tom's hand moved to cover the medallion, but it was too late. The damage was done. Where did you get that? Morrison demanded. Before Tom could answer, the forest around them seemed to come alive. It started as a whisper, the soft sound of moccasined feet on pine needles, the creak of drawn bowstrings, the almost inaudible intake of breath from hidden watchers. The soldiers' horses began to prance nervously, sensing something their riders couldn't yet see. Then Nalnish stepped out from behind a large pine, his rifle held casually but ready. He was followed by a dozen other Apache warriors, materializing from the forest like smoke. They made no threatening moves, but their message was unmistakable. Jesus Christ, one of the soldiers whispered, his hand moving toward his pistol. I wouldn't, Tom said quietly. There are more of them than you can see, and they're better shots than you are. Nalnish spoke in Apache, his voice carrying the authority of command. He didn't look at the white men as he spoke, directing his words to Tom as if the others weren't worth acknowledging. He says, came a young voice from the edge of the clearing, that his friend is being troubled by men who don't understand honor. Tom's heart leaped as Ayana stepped into view, no longer the starving waif he'd found 3 months ago, but a healthy, confident girl dressed in traditional Apache clothing. She'd grown taller, her face fuller, but her dark eyes held the same intelligence he remembered. Ayana, he said, unable to keep the joy from his voice. She smiled at him, then turned to address the white men in perfect English. My father says that Tom Mackenzie is under the protection of the Chiricahua Apache. He says that any harm that comes to him will be answered with blood. Sheriff Morrison's face had gone pale. Now see here, we're officers of the law. You can't threaten— It is not a threat, Ayana interrupted. It is a promise. This man saved my life when he had no reason to help an Apache child. He gave me food when he had little, warmth when he had only one blanket, kindness when the world had shown me only cruelty. Her young voice carried surprising authority. In return, 50 warriors have sworn to protect him. This is our way. Agent Fitzgerald found his voice. The girl was reported missing from the reservation. You're harboring a fugitive, Mackenzie. She was dying in the forest, Tom said simply. I helped her. When her people came for her, I let her go. If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, so be it. Nalnish spoke again, and Ayana translated. My father says the white man's law means nothing in Apache hearts. He says Tom Mackenzie has shown more honor than all the treaty makers in Washington. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Tom could see the calculation in Morrison's eyes. 5 men against at least a dozen Apache warriors, with more certainly hidden in the forest. It wasn't odds that any sensible man would take. Finally, Agent Fitzgerald cleared his throat. Perhaps we've been misinformed about the situation here. It seems clear that Mr. Mackenzie acted in good faith. Damn right he did, Tom said, his anger finally boiling over. And I'll tell you something else. If you're looking for Apache raiders, you're looking in the wrong place. These people aren't raiders. They're fathers and daughters trying to survive in a world that's forgotten how to show mercy. Morrison remounted his horse, his movements stiff with frustrated anger. This isn't over, Mackenzie. We'll be watching you. No, said a new voice from the forest. We will be watching you. More Apache warriors emerged from concealment, not threatening but present, making their point clear. The white men were outnumbered, outgunned, and entirely out of their element. As the soldiers and lawmen rode away, muttering among themselves, Tom felt Ayana's hand slip into his. She'd grown, but she was still small enough that the gesture reminded him powerfully of his own children. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For being the man my father knew you were. For proving that kindness is stronger than fear." Nalnish approached them, speaking in Apache. Ayana listened, then turned to Tom with tears in her eyes. "He says spring is coming. He says that just as the snow melts and the earth grows green again, your heart has melted from the winter that held it frozen. He says you are no longer the man who came to these mountains to hide from his pain." Tom felt the truth of those words settle into his bones. The guilt that had driven him into the wilderness was still there, but it no longer defined him. He'd found something in this harsh, beautiful place, not just survival, but purpose. Not just existence, but life. "Tell your father," Tom said, "that he's right. Tell him that thanks to his daughter, I remember who I used to be before the pain. And thanks to all of you, I know who I can be now." As the Apache warriors began to fade back into the forest, Ayana gave Tom one last hug. "I will come back when the wildflowers bloom," she promised, "and I will bring others who need to know that not all white men have forgotten how to see with their hearts." Tom watched them go, these people who had given him back his humanity when he'd thought it was lost forever. The medallion at his throat caught the afternoon sun, a silver promise that he was part of something larger than his own grief now. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas Mackenzie was not alone. And for the first time since the fire, he was not afraid of tomorrow. Spring was coming to the mountains, and with it, the promise of new beginnings.